And welcome back to Pastor Plek's podcast. I'm your host, Pastor Plek. So glad that all of you are joining us. And with me in studio as we were recording live here in Austin, Texas, it is none other than Nicole, Super Trooper Troup. I'm so glad you're here, Nicole.
Hello, hello.
Nicole has just like awesome insight as always. And so I'm just going to start off with, just because as we're reviewing what we talked about from this past Sunday, I'm just kind of hammer Nicole with a question of like, what'd you think? And like, what popped in your head when you think about, I guess it was Exodus 9.
This is week 2 on the plagues, right? Mm-hmm. Which I'm really thankful you separated them into multiple weeks, because that would have been a lot.
I guess it's week 3, because I guess the first one was the Nile, the second one was frogs, gnats, and flies.
All the bugs.
Yeah, and then this one was livestock and hail.
Right.
Or pestilence, or pestilence on livestock and hail.
Yeah. So each week you've kind of talked about how each one of the plagues defeats one of the like gods or goddesses of like Egypt, and Egypt had lots of gods and goddesses in their mythology or whatever. And so, but one of the things that you specifically mentioned this Sunday is that Egypt has, lots of gods, but like each one of the plagues also kind of defeats a bunch of other gods in addition to the like primary one. So I was just kind of wondering what you meant by that.
So that's really great. So you've got, I think I talked about happy, and you can kind of happy. The happy God is it's a God who's got like, and this is what's so bizarre about this. This is where like there's nothing new under the sun.
Right.
Happy is like I don't know, it's a twin god representing the northern part of the Nile and the southern part of the Nile. And it's a male god that has like a pregnant belly and breasts that look like you could nurse from.
Interesting.
So, I mean, if you want to talk about how everything comes full, this was LGBTQ before LGBTQ was cool, all right? This was...
Okay, I see what you're getting at with the nothing new is under the sun.
Yeah, nothing new. It's wild to me how this is just another god of the Nile. It was a male god representing sort of like the fertility of the Nile and all of that, how it produced so much. And then you also had Apis, which had like a bull. He's like a bull god who,
like a bowl that you eat soup from, or
a bowl
horns?
like horn bowl.
Horn bowl. Yeah.
He's also the god of the. It's weird, right? The god of the Nile. Then Isis is the goddess of the Nile.
Right.
And then you got Khnum, who's the guardian of the Nile.
So many gods for the Nile.
Yeah. So, Khnum is also sort of taken care of because I think he is the husband of Hecate, who is the frog,
the frog.
Yeah, so
fertility lady.
Yeah, so this is why every plague is really attacking the pantheon, because
and the pantheon is the like culmination of all.
I mean, when I looked up, you can go Google pantheon of gods, and there's not one website that has them all, because you'll find like 20 or 30 on one, and then you'll find another 35 somewhere else. And it's like, why can't everyone just get on the same page which ones were the gods?
The thing about ancient cultures like Egypt that had all of these mythologies, like Greece and Rome were the same way, is that there were like household gods, and they're like it kind of like
how could you keep up?
It was the way that people explained the world around them.
Right.
Like we all need some kind of explanation for something,
I guess.
And
I guess if you don't have God of the Bible revealing himself to you, you make it up.
Right. So, like, that was their way of, like, oh, I wonder why the stars and the sun move that way, or why we can only plant in these times of the year and we only harvest in other times of the year. So they come up with, like, different stuff. And, like, obviously the Nile was really important in Egypt. They have, like, 80 million gods for the Nile.
Right. I mean,
because that was, like, their source of water.
So you've got all these different gods. And so, Osiris... This is where it's like, it doesn't even make sense. I mean, okay, listen, there's lots of stuff in Christianity that doesn't make sense, but this really doesn't make sense. Like, how can you have a god of the Nile, like Apis, who's a bull, he's a bull god, or he looks like a bull, a cow. And then you've got Osiris, and it's his bloodstream somehow. Like it.
Yeah. It's.
Okay. Anyway, so I think that's why whenever I was talking about, like, I can give you one or two gods this relates to, But I think we could spend the entire Sunday morning going every god in the pantheon of how this somehow gets at them somehow.
Yeah.
So anyway, so this particular plague one, lots of gods involved with the Nile. The frogs, specifically Hecate, the fertility goddess, who, whenever Khnum made human beings, like on his potter's wheel, Hecate would breathe life into him. Then you've got the next god was Geb, who's the god of the earth. But there's also Seth, who's the god of the desert. He's the god of the chaos. He's like the chaos who's always trying to get at Osiris, who's the
basically
god of,
like think the Greek god Hades.
Yeah, exactly.
Similar.
Yeah, so Seth's the god of the desert, so he's bad. He's always looking out to do bad, nasty things. So that's why the gnats, but then also Geb, came from the dust, which is the earth. It's wild, like, right?
Yeah.
So, and then Khepri, he's got a beetle, like beetle face. But then there's another.
That's tragic.
Yeah. Then there's a fly. There's a fly goddess who is like watch it, or like you kind of like you watch it is kind of like
what
a way
an interesting name.
And it's it's kind of weird because you watch it has like the head of it's like a body and a head of a snake, but with fly wings.
Yeah.
And so that was the goddess of flying things. It's so weird.
Bizarre.
Yeah. So there's so much there. And that's why it gets challenging to kind of figure out, to really specifically point at one. Because when the God of the Bible, Yahweh, he is destroying all their made up thought things. It's there's a saying in pornography, and I know this is like a weird way to go. If you can think of it, there's porn for it. So whatever your imagination is, it's already been created. In your head, whatever goddess or god you can think of, it was already thought of, and it's already created, and it's in the pantheon somewhere.
Yeah.
You just got to go discover it. So when you look at these 10 plagues, they take care of every god or goddess that there was in the pantheon.
Right.
Okay. There you go.
Yeah.
So, but all that pointed to is that the God of Israel is distinct. He's distinct because he doesn't need to kind of recreate himself to be a god or goddess to a specific physical thing. Although he controls all physical things, which is interesting. Like, he doesn't do a thing until it comes to the killing of the firstborn. Because if Moses had like a little finger of fire or something, and he'd like shoot fire from his finger. Pew, pew, and like it was slow motion fire in better, because then you could see it coming, boom, boom, and then like all of a sudden like one of Pharaoh's officials started to melt right in front of him, kind of like Raiders of the Lost Ark. Then people would be like, okay, clearly your God's it.
Yeah.
But God doesn't reveal himself that way. He reveals himself using the nature that God created, which I think is even cooler.
Yeah, that is really cool.
Okay, so anyway, he's doing all this to show that God is distinct, God's people are distinct, and I think the part with whenever he gets to that, with hail, and he's really kind of attacked. There's two ways a sky god Nut is attacked, which is just fun, or sky goddess. Sky goddess Nut is attacked. The sky goddess Nut is attacked whenever he takes the soot from the kiln and throws it into the air, and it becomes a plague of pestilence over all the livestock for only the Egyptian animals.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so so the kiln, which is kind of fun. The kiln is where the bricks were made.
Right, that's where they like fire the clay to.
Yeah, and what's interesting is and I don't know if this was hard for Moses to do. He had to do it within the sight of Pharaoh. So I don't know if hey, can I get a kiln brought in here to the palace? Because I
just
doubt
like take a bucket. I doubt those were movable.
Right.
Like they're movable now, but I doubt they're movable then.
Yeah, so
like
he somehow had to get in the sight of Pharaoh
something?
where he would be walking by and be like, or maybe he just went to a nearby kiln and then God, Pharaoh had to go inspect the troops, see how bricks were being made these days. He's like, Pharaoh, nice to see you here. And this is where I kind of made the joke, second service. I was like, it's like everywhere Pharaoh goes, there's Moses. Like, gosh, can't you put a bell on that guy? I'm like, can I get a warning? Because all of a sudden there's Moses. He's in the kiln. He's like, hey, Moses, check out the soot. And he throws it in the air. And all of a sudden a plague spreads out on all the livestock of all of Egypt, but doesn't touch the livestock of Goshen, of the people of Israel. So that was wild. And then the next one was hail, also sky god. the sky god's very either angry or he's been defeated or she's been defeated, and hail is coming down and smashing man and beast.
Had to have been some like pretty intense hail.
No, we're talking like the size of a talent is what we're talking about, at least in Revelation.
How big is a talent?
100 to 125 pounds. So you're talking about like 14-year-old kids falling from the sky. Like that's like huge, right?
Yeah.
So it's wild to sort of see how that all comes down on them.
So speaking of all these plagues on these livestock, we got these, we got questions from our listeners about this.
Yeah, read the question for me.
So I'll read both of them because they're basically the same, just different verses. So what were the beasts in Exodus 9:9 if all the livestock died? And then where'd the livestock come from in 9:19? So if they got killed by one plague, by the ash in the air,
right?
How is there still livestock left over for hail to?
Yeah, I think this is a great question, and one that I think that deserves to be answered. As if I'm not going to answer it. But yeah, let's read Exodus 9:9. It shall become fine dust over the land of Egypt and become boils breaking out in the sores of man and beast throughout all the land of Egypt. And then 9:19 is, now therefore send your livestock and all that you have in the field into safe shelter, for every man and beast that is in the field and is brought home will die when hail falls on them. And so when the plague of boils came out and it killed, so they took it from the kiln, but the Lord hardened the heart, man and beast.
Did the plague of boils actually kill them?
Yeah, verse 7. Verse 7 is where he says, hey, listen, the next day the Lord did this thing. All the livestock of the Egyptians died, but none of the livestock of the people of Israel died. And Pharaoh sent, behold, not one of the livestock of Israel was dead, but the heart of Pharaoh was hardened. So then in verse 9:19, verse 9, what beasts were still around from the previous plague.
Right.
Okay, so, and hold on. And Pharaoh sent, and behold, not one of the livestock, so that's verse 7. And the Lord said to Moses, take handfuls of soot. So you don't know the time, right? So there's a time of which how long does it take for Pharaoh to go and check on the livestock of Israel?
Yeah.
All right, so when Pharaoh goes to check on the livestock of Israel, he could probably, when he sees that they're alive, he could buy some, steal some, take some. He can start all over. And they can always import livestock from other countries. So it's not like he kills all of the beasts on the planet.
Yeah.
And you don't know how much. I think this is what's challenging about the plagues. It feels like it's 10 days and 10 plagues. It's more like 9.5 months.
Okay, that was going to be my next question, because I've always thought of it as like it all happens in a week or whatever.
No, it's not. It's over a long period of time.
It's over a long period of time. So the Israelites this entire time, like 9 months, a year, whatever, they're still in slavery,
making bricks, finding straw for bricks. Their life hasn't gotten any better.
Right.
And that's why I was saying, I think last time, it's like there can be this point of like, God, I appreciate all the plagues. I appreciate you're making Pharaoh's life sort of miserable and tragic and whatever. But I mean, I don't really care about how long was Frog Fest? Maybe a month? Like, at what point does Pharaoh get tired of the frogs? I think that's where you just sort of assume that this happens in a day. But to make all these frogs multiply, I think God does it. He spawns them faster, but he does it naturally. And so therefore it comes upon everything. And then eventually Pharaoh's like, man, we got to get rid of these frogs. Or the gnats. I mean, there's probably a time where you live with the gnats. You're like, this is frustrating.
Yeah.
And then eventually you get tired of gnats. Mm. So I think that's why with the livestock, they had to start all over again, which is why it was so frustrating. Mm. So ready.
So maybe they did take some Israelite
You get the plague. The plague kills all the livestock. Then you get the boils. The boils affect all the livestock, but they're not dead yet. And then all the livestock are killed. Man and beast are killed in the talent-sized hail. Yeah.
Okay, well, one of the things that you said on Sunday, which I thought was really interesting, is you pointed out that there was this like Moses said to Pharaoh, you know, anyone who doesn't bring their livestock in with them, their livestock will perish.
Right.
But the scripture says that there are some Egyptians who brought their livestock in with them, and so somehow they knew.
So, man, what I love about this part of the scripture, and this gets intense for me because this is God's grace.
Yeah.
This is a picture of Jesus right here. God saying, I'm bringing judgment on the world. Hey, check it out. If you want to come inside, anyone who calls upon the name of the Lord will be saved.
Yeah.
And so this is where we say, like, God's grace is sufficient for all, but effective for some. And in either God's grace, here's what's cool about this. God's grace will either harden your heart or soften your heart.
Yeah.
Because His grace is irresistible. In other words, if God gives you the ability to hear, see, and respond to the gospel, it's irresistible. You're not going to be like, nah, what else you got? But if He doesn't give you eyes to see, if He doesn't give you a heart to hear, then your heart will become hardened or inoculated to the gospel, and you will grow up in church and go, I guess. And you've seen people like this. You've experienced. It's wheats and the tares growing alongside each other, and so you have no idea. And this is when you get when people talk about how they have church hurt. It might not even be a saved person who hurt you, but they really look like a Christian. They sound like a Christian, but they are not born again because you can't born yourself again. Jesus, only by the Spirit of God, allows you to see Him for who He is and the beauty of who He is. So there's people here, and they'll be great church members. They'll be great people. They're going to be awesome. They've been trained well, but because their heart hasn't been open to the gospel, they have no idea that Jesus has saved them from death and hell. And so they'll kind of be sort of resentful of all the other people who aren't doing enough, of all the other people who aren't working very hard, of all the people who just take advantage of the grace of God, and they'll just sort of live angry lives. And that's the part of it where when you understand God's grace, you are constantly living in the grace of God. So the part that like everybody, like this, I always challenge people because I know there are people at church. Maybe even got saved at our church, or came from another church. And then all of a sudden, they are feeling so bitter towards God, and it might because they haven't rested in the Lord, and they're not resting in the Lord, and they're not coming to have their strength renewed, so they're just pissed off at the world, or it could be that they got a version of Christianity that was, I'm gonna do whatever I need to do to be accepted, and is this the Christian thing? I'll do that, and I found friends here, and then what happens, they get burned out and fried because they don't have the actual Spirit of God working, living in them, and their heart hasn't been born again, so they just see people being lazy as opposed to people doing God's will and His work and living out His grace. And I think that's where a lot of sin in our lives comes from that. A lot of sin in our lives comes from our inability to receive grace. Yeah. And I think that, like, this is why I had somebody yesterday go, like, why are you preaching through the Old Testament? Let's talk about Jesus. Because Jesus is right there. That verse,
that's true.
Like, the fear of the Lord. They feared God's word, and they took everybody inside. It would have looked crazy.
Yeah.
For people to take their cows inside.
Yeah.
Their animals inside. All the mules and oxen and livestock that don't fit inside houses. Hey, listen, I'm sorry, we're going to ruin the nice china, and we're going to have to, the kids or the ox sat on the bed or something. But what happened is that they believed the word of the Lord. How much did they believe? I don't know. Enough to bring their cow inside.
Right.
When look at a normal day and there was work to be done. And the rest of the world's going, like, you're crazy. Listen, it's a normal work day. You got to why are you inside? You look like a conspiracy theorist with your cow inside your house. Mm-hmm. Listen, God's word said, God, which God? There's a million gods. There was like 50 other gods that said there's not going to be any hail today. You're telling me that you're going to believe the one God that says to be, hey, listen.
Well, He brought the frogs and the gnats and the locusts and the.
And then they go, well, that was months ago.
Yeah.
You see how, like, that's how
it reminds me of the Rahab and Jericho.
100%.
Like it's that same same thing, because she heard about all that, like how God was delivering the Israelites from all of their enemies,
right.
And like hearing about how they destroyed kings on the other side of the Jordan and right. south from them.
Right. Yep.
Like not in their vicinity.
Yep.
And so like clearly that had an impact on her. Clearly like God doing these miraculous but like not super great works in the like midst of the Egyptians, and they're like, okay, well this guy is serious, so I'm gonna be serious about this God because clearly he's got something going on that all of the others don't.
Right, and I think that's where you're gonna see this over and over again, where people believe. And listen, and this is what I love about this. these people weren't perfect people.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is like they probably still believed in all their other crazy gods.
Right.
They probably were not like forsaking all other gods to follow Yahweh. In fact, I think a bunch of them left Egypt who believed in Yahweh and what he had done. But when Moses goes up on the mountain, who thinks of the golden calf?
That's a good point.
I'll bet you it was some Egyptians saying like, listen, we need something to worship. And guess what the golden calf was? He was the god of the Nile. Let's bring back Apis. He's a golden calf. He's a new reborn calf.
You know, and that kind of also, because later on also they're like, we should go back to Egypt. It was so much better there. We don't have food, you know.
Right,
like,
because
it makes sense that like probably the Egyptians were the ones like starting all the, you know, they're remembering how good it was. Right. And this gets Israelites were like, yeah, you're right.
So why should we be surprised? And this is why I don't want to pound on this too much because I don't want to feel people like guilty, but like if you have church hurt because of church people, I'm like, well, duh.
Right.
And I don't want to be like, get over it, but I kind of want to be like, get over it. I understand they were abusive and they hurt you and they were bad and they were church people. But if you give up on God or you give up on the church because, well, thank God God didn't give up on the church. Thank God didn't give up on Israel because he had some weasels in the mixed bag. And did Israel suffer because of the sin of some? Absolutely. In fact, Korah and his whole team got swallowed up in the sand. I guess what I'm saying is I think if you're looking for a church not to hurt you, don't go to church. And that's what some of you have done. You're like, listen, I'm a rock. I'm an island. As long as I'm not around people, I can't get hurt. 100%. 100%. Way to go. You have solved it. The problem is you will become hard. And you will become, because the very thing you need is watch this, you need to be vulnerable to the church so that it can hurt you, because that is what it means to be Jesus. Because isn't that exactly who Jesus died for? The church. He made himself vulnerable on a cross. Yeah. Can't get more vulnerable than that, so that the people whom he would be saving could reject him and he could take on their sin. Does that make sense? Anyway, I don't want to overdo this because that's not the whole point of this, but that's what it means to be a Christian, is you make yourself vulnerable to the people of God so they ultimately can hurt you, because that's what Jesus did for you. And he's taking in anybody, whosoever would call on him, he's taking in. And at the same time, he's calling those people, and they are the elect, and he's taking broken people who do broken stuff because they have the effects of sin are different on them than they are on you. And what can happen for church people who were raised right, they had two parents in the home that were blessed, they lived in suburbia their whole life, they didn't go to a crappy school, in fact, they went to Christian education, it was awesome, is that they become like almost angry at needy people who are that way because of the way they were brought up, and they didn't have the grace of God. They didn't get to experience joy. And so you can sort of reject the very beautiful thing that God is saving because you can get angry at how come they're not like me. Anyway, but the God is distinct. Our God is distinct, and our people are distinct, and what makes them distinct is not their attitudes or efforts, but God's call in their life. And I think that's the beauty of this entire passage. There you go.
Nice. You wrapped that up really well.
Yeah, there you go. All right.
We do have one other question.
Oh, yeah, what's that last question?
Why would Pharaoh continue to grant Moses an audience through each of the plagues? Why didn't he have him like killed or exiled?
Yeah, and I think this goes back to God's grace. Question. It's kind of like how did Jesus get to go preach in the synagogue and pretty much go like these words, hey, preach good news to the poor, let the lame walk, and the deaf can speak and the mute hear, or mute speak and the deaf hear. And then he's like, these words are fulfilled right now in your hearing. And they're like, pick up rocks to stone him. They take him to the edge of a cliff. He's like, I'll walk through the crowd now. This is where God does what he wants to do. And so since Moses is his guy, he probably Pharaoh did want to kill him, but there was some decorum that you don't like act out in anger in the court or something. And so God used the natural probably civility of the palace to bring the plague on. And, it's like, if God can make Moses throw soot into the air and give plague to everybody, he can probably make him walk out of the palace without getting stoned.
Right. This is not the same Pharaoh that would have known Moses growing up? Or is it?
They would have, yes, he would have known him.
Okay. So he knew Moses wasn't a stranger to him. He wasn't like some random dude. I don't think so.
I think they were either brothers or
cousins or
something. Clearly, it's fair. Remember, Pharaoh's daughter, her son, and it's been he's 80 years old, so this is probably the same, similar age, so they know each other.
Yeah.
They grew up together.
Okay.
Remember, he was 40 when he left, and so it's not like Pharaoh's reign was like 5 years. So I'm assuming they grew up together and lived together and did all the things together.
Yeah.
And so there's a part of this where, like, whenever Pharaoh loses his son,
Mm-hmm.
you got to think.
Yeah.
And it could have been a younger Pharaoh, right? It could have been like, Uncle Moses.
Mm-hmm.
It could have been a younger Pharaoh. And
Yeah.
so he's like maybe 25 or something. Who knows? We don't know how old.
Right.
But like, Moses is 80 and maybe this guy's 40 or whatever, but he loses a son.
Yeah.
And so I think what I love about the Ten Commandments, the actual movie, is it kind of reveals Moses' heart, and he's saying like, man, Pharaoh, listen, your son's going to die. And I care about your kid.
Yeah.
And that's wild to think about.
Mm-hmm.
This wasn't I don't think Moses harbors anger towards the people of Egypt like he did 40 years previous when he killed off an Egyptian.
Yeah.
Like, I think that was youthful angst that kind of was tamped down over time as he saw what a failure he was and kind of understood the depravity of man. And then he sees, like, there, but for the grace of God, there go I. Like, he looks at Pharaoh and like, that's me. That would have been me if God hadn't revealed himself. And so there's compassion and pity he has on Pharaoh. And so I think that's probably the bigger question. Why doesn't God just smite Pharaoh? Well, it's for this very purpose. He's raised Pharaoh up so that God's power may be displayed in him.
Yeah.
So why doesn't Moses get chopped off or killed right here? Well, because this whole thing is in God's control.
Yeah. That's really beautiful.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
All right, hey, thanks for listening to this recap of Exodus 9. I'm so grateful for you watching and listening to the podcast. If you wouldn't mind, would you mind like, share, subscribe, do the things? Let somebody know that you're listening to this if you find it helpful. Even if you don't, just send it along because you're just a big fan. We love you. And so if you have any other questions, make sure you text us at 737-231-0605. And from our house to yours, have an awesome worship.